All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have 6 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Others may be joining us. I want to thank you for being here on time. I really appreciate that. And before we go, I want to talk a little bit about the weekend. I apologize that I was not there, but this is something that Dr. Davis and I decided in advance. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. That we had decided in advance that I would be doing some grading for him, and then next weekend, next face-to-face weekend when we have everybody together, he will be doing some grading for me. He did call me, and we did talk on Monday, and he had excellent feedback about the whole session. And I want a little bit of kind of unpacking from the weekend, just to make sure that that everything that I would have normally have covered with you has been covered. I'll talk a little bit more about the PAP. I hope that was pretty explanatory, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on tonight about what I'm looking for there and what to expect. I know Dr. Davis is fairly new, and I understand he's not going to be back with us next semester, and I hate that because he's so easy to work with. But we'll talk about the PAP. Let me first of all talk about the court cases, and it was my fault, my mistake, that they were not listed in the Blackboard for grade or for that to-do sheet. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to go ahead and count that as an extra credit. So if you will please put that, for the two of you that haven't, if you'll put that into Blackboard, you'll get a grade. I will go back and change those zeros to 100, and that will help you get toward that A or that B. Well, A is what you all are going for, so that will help you get to that. So I'm going to go back and give it a 100-point grade, and it will just simply count toward extra credit. Is that okay with everyone? But I do need for it to be in there because I have to have it in Grade Center. Right now, if you look at your grades, you'll see that it's gotten a grade of 0, but I'll go back and can give it a grade of 100, and it'll just simply be gravy on the top. All right, let's talk a little bit about the court cases and why we did that, because I want to make sure I'm pretty clear about why we choose to do that. You all are in a course that is, of course, it's ethics, it's policy, it's the law, and it's also about advocacy, which is what we'll talk about that last weekend together. And I believe someone joined me. Lenora, welcome. So now I'm just missing Courtney. And I'm sure she'll be here as well. And Lindsay, I know, may be sick and may not join us. So anyway, what I want to bring you back to is face-to-face. This is the weekend Blackboard that you had last weekend. I know Ed went over all these things with you, but if you will notice down at the very bottom, I have opened this to you, and I have all the class court cases, and I'm going to go back and name them like Bethel versus Frazier, and then I'll put your name to it. So if you see something that's inconsistent, I'll go back and change those. But if I do not have yours, please send it to me in Blackboard, and then I can make sure I put it on here, because I think I counted 13, and I think there were like 16 in the class, so I may not have everyone. So if I don't have yours, I will try to find it and put it up there. All right, the question? Hey, Courtney. All right. Hi. Your iPhone comes up as iPhone and not Courtney. Courtney, what I told him before you got here was that, and am I going to see you next weekend, Courtney? This coming weekend?
Yes.
All right, Saturday. You know where to go?
Yes, sir.
All right, good deal. So down here at the bottom of last face-to-face session, you'll have all the court cases. So if yours is not there, let me know. I want to put those there for everybody to have a look. And we also have the other class will have their information there as well. Okay, so for Courtney, what I told him was I'm going to give extra credit for that, so you'll get 100 for it when it goes into Grade Center, but yours is already there. All right, so what I want to look at tonight is session 4, which is, of course, the courses that we are looking at, or the Zoom session that we're in. We're going to talk a little bit here about why court cases are important. This is kind of debrief or to unpack from the weekend you had. I do want to call your attention to a couple of other things that are open to you. These are some courses and some materials that are available by the Friday Institute. I don't know if they're still available. If they're not, I'll take them down, and it may not be because this is, they may have some new ones, so you might need to go to the link to find those. You also have here some guidance on the policy analysis. You also This is a great site as well, information about laws related to schools. When you start writing your dissertation or you start putting together that paper that you're going to be presenting, this is from Wright's Law, and it really does go into some of the different kinds of things that if you decide to do your material on the IDEA or the EESA or any kind of teacher litigation, highly qualified teachers, classroom life, this is really a great resource for you to go to and begin to start building your bank of research materials. So feel free to use that. It's really a great resource, and it's put out by it's put out by the Wright Law Group, but they go and look at many different resources. So I would certainly tag this to put this into your dissertation folder, because this is a place where you can go and download some good information that will be useful for your dissertation. Now you may have to look, and your topic may not be here, you may have to look for it, but it certainly should give you some of that overall research material that you're going to use in Chapter 2. Because in Chapter 2, not only are you doing the research on your particular research problems, but you're doing the broader research that kind of led you to where you are. So if you are doing on the AVID program, then obviously there's some research out there. I believe AVID is a counseling program. Is that right, Daryl?
It's more of a college preparatory program.
Okay, then there would obviously be some research that Daryl would have to do about other programs and the whole research on how we prepare kids for college. So utilize this resource. It's a great, thank you, Daryl. It's a great opportunity for you to find some materials. There's also a policy audit and analysis example 1 and 2. I really would not use these much because these were from the old model, which had like 5 or 6 things, but it's there if you want to just look at them. But they're not the best of models, but they are using the old method before we revised it. We don't really have any really good examples of the new model, but you can certainly use it for some of that. All right, so let me go back and talk a little bit about what you worked on this weekend, and then we're going to start our presentation. This is open to you now. Okay. Okay, I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about why you all spent all of last weekend talking about court cases, talking about the legal system, the court system. I know Ed did a great job on sharing this with you, but this is a course on policy and ethics and advocacy and the law. So why is it important that you spent the weekend last weekend talking about court cases? So to start off, is it really important? So why study the court cases, and really why? All right, the court cases go all the way back, and this is why it is so important. But at the end of this, I really want to have I really want you to understand why we spend so much time on the law, because I've looked at every one of the PowerPoints that you've sent to me, and what I saw was a really clear where you had to dig, and I hope this was what you witnessed or you experienced. You had to really dig into the law. And I hope it got complicated for you at times. I hope you had to go back and reference this, reference federal, reference state. That's the way the laws are. That's the way court rulings are sometimes. And when you do one that's uniquely North Carolina or uniquely South Carolina, it's still going to rely on federal law because of the way the judicial system is set up. It all goes back to the Founding Fathers. They felt like the court system and laws were so important that they put it into the preamble of the Constitution. And their words were to establish justice. It is right up there with just whatever the top 3 are. It is right up there in the beginning of the preamble to the Constitution. The preamble being the justification for why we put together this Constitution. To the establishment of justice is one of those. So that means that our Founding Fathers and the ones who established the Constitution and really established this union really wanted it to be very clear that laws and justice were an important trait of our democracy. And that's why it is within the preamble. And within that, we have to look at judges and justices. And our system of courts rely on a judicial system that is by either elected or appointed judges or justices. They could be called either one. And it is imperative that they stay above politics. Now, I know that's extremely difficult in the climate of today and everything we know about today's laws and today's court rulings, but in particularly when we talk about filling a Supreme Court vacancy, it's really gotten quite political. But that was never the intent of the original justices. The original writers of the Constitution. They really wanted a court that was above the pettiness of politics, because they felt like that to have a court system and to understand what the court has to do, because the court has a critical role of deciding what the lawmakers intended, or deciding cases and deciding guilt or innocence, or whether or not who wins, who loses. So it is imperative that it be partial and independent. That's why it is the third branch of government. It really responds, and in order to become a justice on the federal system, it requires the judicial branch, it requires the legislative and the executive branch working together. The president appoints or nominates. The legislative branch is supposed to approve, to have advise and consent, is supposed to look at it and make a decision based on that. So it's not like the president can just appoint them. They have to be absolutely approved by the legislative branch. So it's really intended to keep the judicial system clear and free of biases. It's not anymore. You and I know that. And in North Carolina, there's a move afoot to elect our judges by party rather than nonpartisan, which is a mistake, because we really ought to be able to elect justices beyond the party label that they carry. So judges and justices have a significant impact on every single part of our daily lives, and not only in our educational life, but also in our personal life. And so that's why they have to be above and beyond politics. So, there's some great examples. A judge can do just about anything to you, to the point of putting you in jail and taking you away and taking away your liberty, taking away your property, sentencing you to death. So judges have awesome responsibility. But their role is to protect the liberties and our rights as citizens. And it is to protect us, to make sure that the majority doesn't override the minority. The whole purpose, one of the major parts of the courts, is to protect us from the majority sometimes. Because we know that if a majority of the people in the 1950s didn't want civil rights, without the courts, we wouldn't have had what we do have. If the majority of the people, if you ask the majority of the people in this country about a particular issue, oftentimes they are 20 to 50 years behind the courts. So the courts are protecting us from the majority. Because if the majority had their way, the minority would always lose. And that's a particularly important function of the courts, is to protect the rights of the minorities. The last bullet, I hope, is true, that nobody is above the law, not even the President of the United States. We'll soon see about that. The courts also, and judges also, serve as a safe haven. They are a place where we can go and we can hopefully feel like that they are meeting our needs, and they're doing it judiciously. They're fair. They deal in conflicts, disputes, and also they really are trying to make sure that we're equitable. So that's the importance of the courts. And the last piece of that too is that they base their rulings on facts and apply the law based on those facts, not about their feelings. They're problem solvers. They are administering justice. They are, sometimes they make those unpopular decisions, and you don't have to think far. Within the last couple of years, Roe versus Wade has been an unpopular decision in many ways. Justices were threatened when they made that, but they made it based on the rule of law. The recent case in 2015, I don't remember the name of it, which granted gay marriage, that was a very unpopular case. The justices did what they had to do based on their interpretation of the Constitution, not necessarily their religious beliefs, but it's based on the Constitution of the United States. So sometimes they have to make those unpopular calls. All right, so why do we spend a lot of time, and why do we spend a lot of time talking about this, and why are you going to be talking about it tonight with Essex, which is one of my favorite books, by the way, and one that you definitely need to buy and keep and put it on your table or put it in your office, because I hope that you'll use it often. So why do we study the court cases? One is, of course, to understand how the judicial system works. Number two is to see how precedent or past court rulings have affected us now, and to see how they affect us in our everyday life. And it also used as a predictor. So when you were looking through those courses, those North Carolina or those South Carolina courses, you were seeing a ruling that hopefully you can see how it affects your everyday life. Most of those court cases were clearly education in general, and affects classroom teachers or affects administrators. So they impact your everyday and your professional life and sometimes your individual rights. But you can also, within those court cases, and remember, court cases, when they make a decision, it's like, and I'm doing a motion here, you can't see me, but it's like making a stacking. When they make one court case, the next court case cannot deviate too much from that original court case, but it can add to it. It can kind of narrow the definition, or it can go off into another tangent. It can't generally overturn another federal court case if it's on the same level. Only the Supreme Court or the higher court can do that. But generally, it builds upon those past decisions to make applications to the current issue at hand. So a landmark court case, those that you did it for on the weekend were really landmarks for North Carolina or South Carolina. The big landmark cases are Tinker, some of those big ones like that you hear about often. But the landmark cases are the ones who really begin to infect policy and our day-to-day local operations of school districts a whole lot more than most. So that's a landmark case. The courts, of course, affect law through the common law system, through decisions made by the courts, and then, of course, by precedent, which is that building upon things that have gone on before. All right, so to kind of wrap up or kind of talk a little bit about what I missed on Saturday and Sunday, on your individual court cases, just one thing, and I know you put this in your PowerPoint, so you may want to think back to it, but just one particular thing about your court case, and I would love it if each one of you would share one thing about it. How does that particular court case affect the local policies that you have in your district? Who wants to stab at it? Tell me your court case too. Who wants to stab? Who? Come on. Come on, eager beavers.
Okay, so I'll go.
Thank you, Lenora.
You're welcome, except I don't remember the name of my court case. That's a little embarrassing. I think it was Tina Kelly. Oh, I know. It was Tina Kelly versus the Carteret County Board of Education. And basically what my case was about was a teacher assistant that refused to drive the bus. So she brought in a doctor's note indicating that she should not drive the bus. So how does that, and basically what happened is that the case was so confusing, but what I was able to figure out, or Dr. Davis, like personally knew someone who worked for the Carteret County Board of Education and got in contact with me the other day. He told me, and he was able to add some more information to the case. And basically what he relayed to me was that her assistant had signed in writing when she was hired that she was aware that she was going to have to drive the bus. Right. So anyway, her case was thrown out because she waited too long basically to file it. And she passed that 180-day statute of limitations. She appealed it a couple of times. And it looks like she abandoned it. And I don't quite know why she abandoned it. But anyway, so how does that apply or affect local policies? I think that it affects Kannapolis because we need to be very strategic, looking ahead several years out, seeing what our needs are. Just because we may not have a shortage of bus drivers currently, we need to plan for the future and anticipate that we might need to have a shortage of bus drivers and that we may need to call on our staff, such as teacher assistants and custodians, to drive those buses. And in doing so, we need to be very articulate and be very clear and transparent and make sure that they are aware of what those responsibilities are. So what we've done is we have, and we've been doing this for the last couple of days, is interviewing people who are teacher assistants, but they are also, their title is a substitute bus driver. So that's what we can do in Kannapolis, is make sure that we get that job title correct.
That's an excellent idea too, because I've never thought about that, because then when you're applying for the job, it is pretty clear what the job is. Excellent idea. Good luck. Good. That's good. Anyone else want to share how it relates to your local policies? That's an excellent example of how it may affect or has affected. Anyone else?
I know that with my case, it was dealing with Kennedy Charter versus CMS in 2007. And basically, the school system had to end up paying the charter schools out of their, I want to say, general funds.
Yep.
And basically, what it meant to me was that more charter schools are going to emerge in CMS, and they will have their fair share based off the per pupil expenditure. And it's going to affect a lot of allotments in public schools.
Right. And also, Daryl, they have already get more than their fair share. You haven't heard me preach yet about charter schools, but I'm not a fan. And what it also created, one of the policies that also created was for districts to create this thing called a fund aid. And if you're at the district office, or if you know someone in the financial part of the district office, you really ought to, in North Carolina, you really ought to look at what your district's Fund 8 money is. Because when that court case was handed down, there was a little piece in there that allowed districts to designate certain pots of money that charters couldn't get to. And so we created this Fund 8. And I know districts are really protective of it. And I would imagine Charlotte Meck probably has upwards of millions and millions of dollars in its Fund 8. And charters can't get that. So that created an immediate effect on districts and policies of creating a Fund 8 with designated funds that charters couldn't get. Excellent choice. Sugar Creek. Oh. Anyone else?
So my case was in reference to Dorothy Davis being an English high school teacher with the Macon Board of Education in 2006. And basically, she was not, her contract was not renewed. She wasn't granted tenure after 4 years of teaching. She appealed quite a number of times, but basically it was insubordination and unprofessionalism. The principal made the recommendation, superintendent did an investigation. There were some discrepancies, though. However, during the investigation, courts ruled on the side of the school board in favor of the decision to not renew her contract. And how that applies to CMS, I think we have to be very careful about how we conduct our investigations, making sure that we're fair in doing so, making sure that our records are accurate, and that we can supply those records at any time that it's requested because of those documents being public. And also, I think we also have to be very clear in our expectations for facilitated instruction and non-instructional duties as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the strength of that particular case was the background, all the research, all the paperwork they had in place. I mean, that lady didn't really stand a chance. Because I think the district, if I remember the case correctly, the district was well prepared. Even the superintendent went out and did some evaluations, didn't he?
He did.
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
All right, one more. Anybody want to share? Anybody?
My case was Shannon Carter versus Florence School District 4 in regards to parents being eligible for reimbursement of fees if their child is not able to receive an appropriate education in the school district that they're zoned for. And I just think that that case helps with policies regarding IEPs and that process in which that happens at the school level, who's involved, and what happens when a parent complains or is not satisfied with the IEP, and you know how that reevaluation of the IEP is structured at the school level.
Yep, I think you're right. I don't know the case very well because I think it's a South Carolina case, but that certainly is going to drive a lot of LEA policies on that. All right, so thank you very much. All right, so all right, so as I believe we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reports tonight, and we start with Annie. I think you have Fowler chapter 12, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing, Annie, and it's yours.
All righty. is. Okay, can you hear okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I had the last chapter in Policy Studies for Educational Leaders. I thought it was one of the easier chapters to read. It just summed up educational policy in the United States, but they did it, or he did it in a really interesting way, retrospective and perspective, basically looking in the rearview mirror and then looking out the windshield. He started kind of bookend his first sentence in the first chapter and the last chapter of, I think it started out in the first chapter of Dorothy going, Toto, I don't believe we're in Kansas anymore. And the last chapter, the question was, so if we aren't in Kansas, where are we? And basically it just, illuminated the unpredictable policy landscape or just educational landscape that we are in as of today. But when you look back at time periods, it's very clear how, whether it was values, economics, international influences, how those structures and policies shaped where we are in education today. So the focus questions for the chapter were, how has education in the U.S. changed throughout history? How do policy proposals of today relate to those of the past? And I, when reading this, I found it interesting how one seemed to be a linchpin of the other. Why is the policy environment today so turbulent? I think we are seeing that very, very clear as leaders in education. And 4, what will education policy probably be like in the future? So those were the 4 threading focus questions. And I designed the presentation to really just highlight each of the time periods and how the structural frameworks, like the pillars of society, how they affect. But as I do that, I want the group just to think through, again, how do the policy proposals of today, how do they relate to how education looked through a historical lens? So I will be asking that at the end. So the chapter started out with just the Young Republic, and basically it was, the origin of the United States as we know it, and the time period that they glanced at for that was 1783 through 1830. And so the pillars on the right, so in the middle of all the slides, it will be, this is kind of the highlights, the takeaways. But all of that was done through the lens of what you see on the right of the slide. Like, it was done through the lens of competing values. How did that either detract, support, shape, mold, policy types, the institutional choice? Was it singular schools? Was it district? Was there superintendencies, principals? And then how does other countries, just the international influence? So going back to the Young Republic, when reflecting and reading that, honestly, if everyone can picture Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls, the one schoolhouse where it's the young teacher that usually teaches until she gets married. So values were, it was competing of teaching at home versus, I send them to school just to learn the basic literacy skills, but I may only go 2 to 3 months out of the year because I really value the farmland and I need my kid to help out with farming. Policy types at this point, it wasn't very strong. It was very individualized. If pursuing academics beyond the basics, that's where it usually only allowed for your wealthy families to go into private or boarding schools. Again, local and voluntary, but there was, again, this is where you began to see the flavor of the international community. I mean, it was truly, European settlers that brought a lot of their way of thinking. So I think from the very beginning, we could see an influence of the immigrants from, like I said, the European community. The rise of the common school, that was 1831 to 1900, and if you've ever, we've all heard of Horace Mann and his influence of how that came to be. Basically, this is when your one town supported with just one church and one school began to spread out into farm community, and there and lied increase in poverty and crime. So Horace Mann, being the philosopher and his principled guiding principles, thought that the education in school was a great way to support that and to basically address the concerns. So here you began to see values of regular school attendance, the longer school year. You had graded schools, basically uniformity. Everybody learned the same thing, but this was the budding star of state educational agencies, county superintendencies, and definitely moving away from distinctly American and toward emerging international norms. So early 1900, and then we began to see a shift.
All right, so before you move on, just one quick little question for you, Annie.
Yep.
I don't know, and you might. Do you know when the when the Kannapolis city systems were created? Here.
Say that again, Josh.
Do you know when the
Kannapolis
were created?
I do not. I know that we started out as a Cannon school, which operated off of Cannon Mills. I know it was in the early 1900s, and then that's basically Cannon School is a part of our still one high school town of A.L. Brown. But the school was started as a support system for our factory workers, which was Cannon Mills. And they lived in our GI houses, which is our mill housing that surrounds the perimeter of town, which was the mill is no longer there, but very much paralleled what was happening, the rise of the common school, and even the next phase, which is the scientific sorting machine.
And I would probably say that for most school districts, probably not your city districts, because they may have been a little bit later, but for most school districts in North Carolina and probably South Carolina, this was really the beginning of the county school district systems. Where we started seeing the development of a county system, because that kind of goes along with the county superintendent. So this was really the beginning, this particular stage of 1830, kind of before 1831, it was, you were lucky if you had a school. You were lucky if that young person showed up to teach or if the kids showed up to teach. But in 1831, that's when there started to be some consistency, and that's why Horace Mann is called the father of education. I mean, that's why we have insurance from him, because he is really known for the person who really gave public education its structure. And so it would be an interesting question for you to go back and find out when your district was established. Was it in this particular common school phase, or was it in the very next one? All right.
Okay. So the next one is probably what most of our experiences come from. I know that I even was in school during this period, but it's called the Scientific Sorting Machine, 1900, 1982. And this is when basically scientific inventions, advances in daily life, just to people begin to live a healthier lifestyle and see that there's going to be longer expectancy. But I also see this as kind of your widget period, where It's after the World War II, the Industrial Revolution is just, we're booming in that part, but we're creating workers to adapt and fit those career paths. So you don't see a whole lot of creative thinking. Basically, thinking out of the box is not within these educational pathways. There is a lot of, remember the Redbirds, Bluebirds, ability grouping. There are extracurricular activities because we are getting into secondary schools. I know that in one of the other classes, I did something to where basically junior high schools was a reform out of this. School psychology, standardized achievement tests, vocational guidance became a big one in the secondary schools, but it was a pathway, and you kind of were tracked on that early on, and there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room if you had other interest. And where we are now, I believe this one was 83 to present. So the first is basically reforms that complete, restore, or updated the 1900 to 1982. And this is where what we're seeing now, where, we don't want to track kids. We do want them to think critically and have flexibility in their schedule and try new things, especially at the secondary level. Inclusion versus exclusion, really trying to find the the best placement instead of isolation. Our EC children, it's trying to find spend as much time as they can in our regular educational settings. Requirements, technology infusion, state and national standards. So we're just basically up in the ante and the rigor in the continuity of expectations there. Where teachers, it was, and it still is predominantly and highly high percentage of female and white females. This is where we have tried to tap in to have our staff and our school communities reflect the populations that we serve. Educational I still consider it a flat profession that not a whole lot of opportunity unless you come out of the classroom, but there are career ladders. And if you do want to advance to a coaching administrative position, those options are there, where once upon a time it was just one teacher and very little education. We are very blessed. This is one good thing I'm seeing out of this is differentiated staffing. You have your specialized, your STEM teacher, your music, your instructional coach. Prep programs are better than ever. Teacher inductions, mentors. We do have professional learning standards, and a lot of our communities believe in site-based decision making. We're marketing more than ever, which causes a lot of competitiveness and values and policies of charter schools, magnets, merit pay, school psychology, privatization of support services, subsidies and vouchers, all of that. Some of it's embedded into the public schools, but some of it it's seen as or viewed as a competitor. So I think the question and where I would like to hear from you, because I don't think anything I shared were things that we didn't know or probably addressed in an earlier chapter, but how does the policy proposals of today, some of the things that I just rattled off, how does it relate to those of the past? Do you see a correlation? Is one a springboard to the other? And then how does that affect us as leaders? Or what do we need to be looking at as we look through the windshield again, as opposed to the rearview mirror?
So, Annie, I think Lenore mentioned this earlier with the being proactive with developing policy. For example, the TA, adding bus driving position to use practices and policies of the past that have put us in sticky spots, and then included those in future proposals and planning.
Yeah, I think was it the Courtney case that she was speaking of, or what Dr. Stone was saying is that using it as precedents to help drive the decisions instead of reinventing the wheel. I mean, that's what prior policies in court cases should be. I know that it's a very turbulent time, and it can be very taxing and often make us question this profession, but I don't think personally I would change it for anything. And when I look back at where we were, either the young Republican with, no support, you just hope they darkened your door and you never knew who they were, to producing widgets, so to speak. And just so, what are your thoughts comparative to where we've come from?
Well, Andy, let's take a particular policy. Let's take a particular policy area and kind of see where it's progressed. So you all help me with this. So let's look at the teaching of girls. All right, in that first stage, do you think girls went to school? Was there a policy in that first long history of American history? Did girls go to school?
No, I don't think they went to school until, Horace Mann, but only if you were white at that point.
Right. So the attendance of girls, if you want to follow that through the historic perspective, because now we have compulsory attendance policies, and it doesn't mention boys, girls, or anybody. But originally, when Horace Mann even started, it was a boy thing. It was a male prerogative to be in public schools, and that's what the public schools supported. The curriculum was all built around males. The curriculum was built around the particular community in which the males were in. That's why vocational courses really got started. It really had nothing to do with females. The vocational, the CTE courses really originally started, and the policies developed around them to take care of the boys who were farming, the boys who were going to off to war, the boys who had to have some other type of curriculum material. So following the education of girls, not at all. And then, as Annie said, when the compulsory attendance rules came in, it was an expectation that girls attended, but many school districts would not allow them to come even when it became an expectation. You just don't want girls in the school. Girls were wasting their time in the school. They're supposed to be looking for husbands and things like that, or at home. So the involvement of policy, because now we wouldn't even think about that. So that shows you how the policies build upon each other and they progress upon us as we as a society evolve. So, that's one example. Now it makes no difference whatsoever. And all of our courses, even with Title IX, even our extracurricular and the other things that we do that predominantly benefit our male students, are now regulated by board policies and by laws. So what you see, Title IX developed because girls were being excluded from a number of things, even when they got into the building and were required to be in there for attendance. They still weren't allowed to participate in extracurricular activities. And so that's how the law has shaped that particular policy about the education of girls, where now we don't even need to have a specific policy about the education of girls. You can put African Americans in there. You can put ESL and have the same flow of how policies have evolved. You can put ESL students. You can put now you can put transgender. This is how the evolution of our policies, how they go. Thanks, Annie.
So I think, again, this was, just a wrapping up of the text, but I think summarizing or synthesizing my takeaways throughout the whole text would be policies will continue to forever shape educational reform. So I think, and often driven by ideologies and politicians, we're seeing that more than ever today. But lastly, I think it's just a critical component that as a leader myself, it is in my best interest to be involved. I don't know, with Title I, I do get involved in, I don't know if I'm helping to shape, but I do get asked sometimes to be at the table with Title I, and I think if there's an invite, I need to be there. And too often, I think we're spread so thin that we're exhausted, literally, and sometimes it's hard to advocate for a certain thing, but I do think it's our obligation and our responsibility as educational leaders to do that. And any questions, or what questions do you have? That was a really tough book.
It was a tough book. It's not my favorite.
Not mine either.
Annie, and that's why I hope you didn't buy it, anybody, or do sell it when you finish with it. So Annie, let me just leave you with one quick question, and then we'll move on to Daryl to start us in Essex. But where do you think, what's the next big area that we're going to have policy being developed in? Anybody? I mean, what's the next big area that policy is going to be developed in? Because as you've known,
Grading?
Pardon?
Maybe something around grading or, grading.
How we grade?
And I think something in relation to virtual learning or e-learning, which may affect attendance also.
Oh, yeah.
I think something that involves us being inclusive of all groups.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Anyone else want to gander? You could write the next book, and we could use it for the next class of 708 about what next in policies. It's got to be better than what we had. Anyway, before we move on from going into Essex, let me just do one final little commercial for policies. We've spent a third of the class talking about policies and the role of policies, and as Annie hit in her presentation, they are constantly changing. They are modeled by a bunch of influencers, and these influencers are the people that we are around a lot. Annie's last bullet point, I think, is the big takeaway from our whole units on policies, and that is we've got to be active and advocate. We cannot sit back and have policies delivered to us without our voice in it. So we have to be a strong advocate for the kinds of policies that we want, because if we don't, we're going to get the kinds of policies that we don't have any input in. So when we finish up this course, not only are you going to know about the current policies, but hopefully you'll have a stronger urge and sense of how to be an advocate to keep people from doing things to us. All right. Thank you, Annie. All right, Daryl, you have the distinct pleasure of starting us off in really not a bad book, Essex.
Woohoo!
Yeah. If you want to share your screen, and that will get us going. You can throw Fowler away. We're now on Essex.
All right. Oh, I am going too fast here. All right, so I had school law and the public schools, chapter 1. And this chapter was titled Legal Framework Affecting Public Schools. And I want to start off with my interactive slide by just posing a question to the group. What do we already know about public schools and law? We've been dealing a lot with court cases, and Dr. Stone has talked about it, Dr. Davis has talked about it. What do we already know?
Well, that it public schools and law, it's honestly, it shapes it. We're following law and policy. Of course, that's not always the same, but
I think, Annie, what you're trying to say is that schools are functioning because of the laws that have been legislated.
thank you, Lenore. You're my yang to my yin. Yeah.
And to take it a step further, Lenora, we wouldn't operate. We wouldn't even have schools if it were not for the law. The law is
what I wanted to say.
we operate because the law says we can. We get our charters, and when you go back, Annie, and find out when Kannapolis City School Systems was created, you will also probably find that there was a charter from the General Assembly because of a law that was passed by the General Assembly to allow Kannapolis City Schools to operate. And every single one of our districts will have that, something put into the law of North Carolina that allows us, the general statutes, that allows us to operate. That might be a good exercise for you when you have nothing to do on a Saturday and you want to research public school law in North Carolina, South Carolina. Find out when your district was created, why, who the founder, who the people were. But go ahead, Gerald, I'm sorry.
All right, so just to kind of open everything up with law, the book talks about different sources of law. And public schools as governmental agencies must operate within the boundaries of law at the following levels: local, state, and federal. Therefore, school personnel are expected to perform their prescribed duties within a framework of law. And that kind of goes back to what y'all just said. We didn't have law in place and this framework in place, then there's no telling what schools will be doing, even though we know things that go on currently under the framework of law. A number of legal sources affect administration and operation of schools, and we're going to break down some of these legal sources. So the first is the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. We all know that the Bill of Rights is the primary source of individual rights and freedom. Schools are agents of the state, and being that we are agents of the state, we must respect constitutional rights of not only students, but school personnel. I mean, we know that our freedoms are protected within those Bill of Rights.
Hey, Darryl, real quick, can I interrupt real quick? I'm
Yes.
sorry. You guys, when you evaluate me or when you do your student opinion surveys, you'll say he's the rudest person he interrupts, but that's kind of, I don't know, are you shaking your head? Yeah, where here, but I want you to, I saw you, you're on my screen, but I want to ask you, does anybody remember from our first session together, originally, how many were there in the Bill of Rights? Anybody remember? Because I've always thought, I taught history forever, it was only 10, but how many were there originally?
13?
Was it 14 or 12?
12. 12. And they got rid of the first two. All right, go ahead, Darryl. I won't interrupt again, Lenora.
No problem. So as it pertains to the 14th Amendment, this particular amendment deals with due process. It ensures fundamental fairness in matters involving deprivation or liberty and property. And there are other key amendments that the book pointed out as well. I didn't go in detail with those, but the First Amendment, obviously, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Eighth, the 10th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment are all important amendments as it pertains to school. The book also talks about state constitutions. So this is based off the 10th Amendment. Education is left to states' control. As we know, it represents the basic source of law for individual states when we talk about state constitutions. They restrict power of legislative bodies, but however, they require legislative bodies to perform various functions for schools. And some of these functions include establishing systems of public education, providing funding, and providing operational schemes.
I love Oprah there.
Everybody gets a constitution. Also, statutes. The book kind of breaks down a lot of key terms as I'm reading through this introductory chapter. Statutes represent acts of the legislative branch of government, and it's derived from the Latin meaning it is decided. I know this past Saturday we talked about a lot of law terms coming from Latin roots, and that was just something I noticed and was able to associate from the lesson on the weekend. School district policy, rules, and regulations are based on statutory law, and challenge is only brought to courts when a statute conflicts with the U.S. Constitution. So that's the only time we'll really see some type of challenge of a statute. The book also talks about state agencies as another source of law. In particular, it talks about a state board of education. The state boards of education, they determine the direction of education within its state. It functions as a planning and an evaluative a body that functions directly below the legislator. And something that I learned from that, most state boards have 6 legal powers in common. And those 6 legal powers include the following: establish certification standards for teachers and administrators, establish high school graduation requirements, establish state testing programs, establish standards for accreditation of school districts and teacher and administrative preparation programs, review and approve the budget of the state education agency, and also develop rules and regulations for the administration of state programs. State agencies continued. You have the local school boards, and they exercise general supervision over schools within a district, formulation of district policy. They are viewed as the policy-making body. School district policy is based on state statutes that come from the local boards. Policies are considered to be legal, enforceable, if it's consistent with state and federal constitutions. So it has to be some type of alignment there for policies to be able to go through. And we kind of learned that through our policy flowchart activity. The vision of the school board is closely aligned to the district's mission as well. The book also outlines the U.S. system of courts, and you kind of see a little illustration here that's kind of a general aspect of it, and we'll go a little in depth. But the judicial system consists of federal and state courts. The courts perform 3 types of judicial functions, right? So we have settling controversies through applying basic principles of law to specific factual circumstances. We have interpret legislative enactments, and also determine the constitutionality of legislative or administrative mandates. And on the left side, it kind of breaks down levels of court: Supreme, Court of Appeals, and District Court. And the book does a great job of kind of talking about each type of court system within the U.S. courts. In particular, it talks about federal courts. With federal courts, they deal with cases involving federal or constitutional issues. Cases in which the parties are residents of different states, includes district courts, appellate courts, and the Supreme Court. And some facts that I was able to pull from the book, it said that 95 federal courts are in the U.S., and at least 1 is in each state. It's represented by circuit courts of appeal. The 13 federal circuit courts include 11 geographic jurisdictions over a number of states and territories. And if you look in the book, there's a table 1.1 on page 8, kind of breaks down those jurisdictions, and you kind of see where they are geographically in relation to each other.
Can I add something, Daryl?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I don't know if you've got your book with you in front of you, but you'll notice that North Carolina and South Carolina both are in District 4. And that's the appeals court. And so you probably, you probably remember when the President Trump declared the national emergency, and some of his quotes a little bit later on, he said that it's going to be appealed in the 9th Circuit, and it's always in the 9th Circuit. Well, when you look at the 9th Circuit has California in it. And so that's why when people try to win their cases, they try to find a favorable appeals court. And California is the most liberal. And so that's why when President Trump's immigration or wall order or emergency order was put in place, that's why it was filed in the 9th Congressional, or in the 9th Appeals Court, because that's the most liberal one, because it has California, which is the predominant state. Oregon and Washington, very liberal states. Now, the case was also filed in the 6th Circuit, which is Kentucky, Tennessee, I think it goes up to Ohio, and that's the most conservative, that and the 5th, which has Texas in it. And so the purpose of filing it in both different appeals courts is when you have a disagreement, it makes it to the Supreme Court quicker. So that's what Dr. Donald Trump is hoping, is that the Supreme Court or the appeals court number 9 will say it's illegal. The appeals court number 6 or 5 will say it's not. Then that way it'll get a rush job to the Supreme Court for them to decide. That's how you pick your courts sometimes. And that's what's happened here. But North Carolina is in the Fourth Circuit. North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and we're pretty moderate circuit court or appeals court, appeals court. We're pretty moderate. Things that come through here are generally in Washington, D.C. and Maryland are also in ours. So generally things that come through here are, well, D.C. is in its separate one. Generally things that come through here are pretty much, you really don't know where it's going to go. But the reason I mention this is because sometimes in your court cases, if you had a federal court case instead of a North Carolina one, sometimes you'll see that it was decided in the Fourth Circuit or in the Fourth Circuit of Appeals. That means that it only applies to those states in the Fourth Appeals. So if something is decided in the Fourth Circuit of Appeals, that means only North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, we're the only ones who have to go by it until it makes it to the Supreme Court. And once the Supreme Court rules on it, then it becomes legal, or that they have the final call for everybody. So that's how the appeals courts work. And so whenever you see something that's decided by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeal, it doesn't apply to us. We're not in the Sixth Circuit. So it's either got to be the Fourth Circuit or the Supreme Court for it to apply to us. Thanks, Daryl.
Quick question: do certain jurisdictions or do they collaborate with each other on certain decisions, like precedents? Or I know they follow precedents for other court cases, but go ahead.
Occasionally, they will reference that this was decided in the Sixth Circuit, but it is not a precedent for the Fourth Circuit, so you don't have to use it. But sometimes they'll cite it when they're rulings. They'll say this was decided in the Sixth Circuit. So they do look at each other's rulings, but as far as calling up to see, they don't. They operate independently.
Okay.
That's why if you're liberal, you always want to go to the Ninth Circuit. That's where you get what you want, in the Ninth Circuit. And if you're conservative, go to 5 or 6.
All right, so jumping back in, state courts. State courts hear cases involving issues related to state constitutional laws, state statutes, and common law. Many education cases are heard in state courts because they don't involve a federal question. State statutes prescribe the types of cases that must be heard by various courts within a state. And these are some of the different types of courts that the book mentioned. The courts of general jurisdiction, the courts of special jurisdiction, immediate appellate courts, and then it also did a great job of breaking down the 5 stages of trial, which was interesting to me as well. You have the pleading stage, you have the pre-trial stage, discovery stage, trial stage, and then the post-trial stage. And then the book actually goes from there into the Supreme Court and how decisions are pretty much decided and how it's kind of abbreviated and publicated as well. Do we have any questions?
Does anyone have any comments about the legal framework? Come on, you got to make Daryl answer one question, somebody. He's the expert on chapter 1. No one? All right, Daryl, they're letting you off. Okay. All right, thanks, Daryl. Good job. All right, Josh, you're up. Chapter 2. Yours is a good topic, very relevant.
Yes, very extensive. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I had school law and the public schools. I had religion in the public schools, which, like you said, was pretty interesting. I learned a lot, but it's a very thorough chapter. So I tried to condense the 40 or so pages into 10 slides. And if I missed something, please let me know. All right, so let's start off with what is separation of church and state. And regarding religion, our Bill of Rights ensures that there is a separation of church and state, which guarantees religious freedoms and prohibits the establishment of a religion by the government. The beginning of the chapter talks a lot about how the past decade has brought a lot of tension with that subject between the church and state within public schools across the country, and that this has led to an increase of court cases where the courts have actually been called to determine the constitutionality of certain practices within public schools. So one of the landmark cases that actually established the separation of church and state was Reynolds versus the United States, or upheld the separation of church and state, which was in 1879, that courts must maintain a neutral position toward religion. And it upheld Jefferson's view that there should be a wall of separation between church and state. And I think it goes back to what you were saying, Dr. Stone, and also Dr. Davis over the weekend, that, you know, that was the intent. The courts should be neutral. They shouldn't be political. They shouldn't be religious when they're doing their work. And increasingly, I believe that kind of establishment is going away, that we are becoming more political and partisan in our courts. And then the last of the landmark cases, or another one, is Cantwell versus Connecticut, which forces the states to have that neutral position as well. So that's kind of where we get that idea from.
Okay, I don't know if you're going to do this a little bit later on, Josh, but just to throw it out there to Josh and to others, what's happening with religion in your district about the separation of church and state? Because it's pretty clear. What was that, 1896 or 1800s, in that 1879? That's a long time ago that principle was established, the separation of church and state. And we are state. If you get a check from the state, you are state. There you go. You're a state employee. So what challenges are pushing on it now? Here, what's a big one in North Carolina that was just been in the news lately, and it's been something we've had going on now for 5 years? That, anybody want to guess? Because I feel I shouldn't have an opinion on this one, but I do. I do. I should have an opinion on it. What's one that's been in the news here lately where actually the North Carolina Senate Speaker went to Charlotte and had an opportunity to speak down there about something?
Was it HB2?
No, not HB2. Vouchers. Remember? President Berger went down to, I think it was in Charlotte, and right now we know that about 5 years ago, the General Assembly created this thing called vouchers. Now, this is a clear not separation of church and state, because a voucher means that here, Steve Stone, I can take my child and take $8,000 and put him in a private school. And that private school could be based on religion. That private school could be based on anything. It could be based, it doesn't even have to have the standard curriculum. I believe they do have to give one standard federal mandated test, but they really, I mean, I could create my own school and teach the principles of Steve. And I am getting tax money for that. And so what we have now in North Carolina with the vouchers, or I think they're called opportunity scholarships, what we have now is a tremendous amount of millions and millions and millions of dollars that are being transferred from the public coffers to private schools that are, many of them, 60% of them are religious in nature. And so I understand people say, I pay my taxes, my money ought to go where my kids go to school. But when you pay your taxes, you have a fine alternative in your community, which is your public school. You choose to take them somewhere else. So your money should stay with the public schools, in my opinion. So that's one, vouchers. And what Speaker Berger said was that, well, if they're not using it enough, we ought to loosen the rules and let more people take advantage of it. An idiot, but that's just my opinion. What other issues are out there about religion? Do any of you know of anything that comes to your, at your principals meetings or at any of your meetings, have you ever had the superintendent talk to you lately about any kind of issues regarding religion or separation of state religion?
I just remember this weekend in the class, he just said, that we can't have it on programs for graduation, and only the kid who's actually speaking at the graduation, if they choose to say a prayer, then they have the freedom of speech to state that prayer. But other than that, it can't be in the program and it can't be a part of it.
How many of you allow prayer at graduation? How many of you allow prayer at ball games?
Only if the team is praying amongst themselves. I know when I was coaching, we would do that at the end of every practice.
Have you noticed a change in how the coach can interact with the team when they're praying? Now the law says that the coach has to stand back and can't participate, but can be a supervisor for it. So that's being challenged in the course as well. So this is probably one that's moving very fast and being challenged a lot. So go ahead, Josh. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So just very quickly, the First Amendment, there are two clauses. The first is the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the state from passing laws that aid a religion or show preference to a religion, and then the Free Exercise Clause, which prohibits the state from interfering with individual religious freedoms. And that's going to come into to case a lot when we talk in some further slides about students' rights with practicing their religion. So the two clauses forces public schools to remain neutral in their daily operations regarding religious matters. And you just referenced this. You get a paycheck from the state. School officials are government officials, which means they must be neutral while serving that role. And it'll go in later talking about how we certainly as teachers and public school officials have the right to exercise religion just when we're not in our duties as public school officials. All right, so the first thing that the chapter really talks or tackles is this concept of prayer. And the first is prayer in schools. And again, I just tried to highlight what the sections of the chapter, what the main point was, because again, there were so many. So prayer in schools, school-sponsored prayer is not allowed in public schools, but student-led prayer is allowed and protected by the First Amendment. If it is student-initiated, then it can happen. As long as, and I might be saying this wrongly, or incorrectly, but what I see is that the pattern is that as long as it does not cause a huge disruption to the learning environment. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes. Now let me ask you, Josh, can a student stand up in the middle of math class and stand up and do a verbal prayer?
I would think that would be a disruption to learning, and it could not happen.
Exactly. Do you think they could just stand up and do a silent prayer?
I would still think the standing up causes a disruption.
I would agree. Do you think?
And Lenore and I dealt with this year in elementary school. We had several students at the beginning of the year when the Colin Kaepernick thing was going around that they would not stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which is their option and their right. And we'll talk about that at the end of this. But specifically, we had a case where a student was being disruptive while he was sitting and the rest of the class was standing reciting the pledge. And so we actually said that our teacher was right in saying that the student could not be, disrupting the other classmates while they were opting to say the pledge, because the parents got a little bit aggravated that the student was reprimanded for being disruptive. So that affected us.
Can you have prayer around the pole in the morning?
As long as it's student initiated.
So you're gonna have 200 students out there around the pole without adults?
Well, I think that adults could possibly supervise for safety purposes. I don't know.
Well, they better. That's their job.
I agree with Josh on that one.
No, as far as a prayer, something like that, one, it has to be outside of the school day. You can't let them go out. You start
Right.
school at 8. You can't let them go out at 8:05 to do that. But yeah, if they're going to need to let someone in the building know, and you as principal are certainly going to want to have a couple of teachers out there to supervise 200
Right.
students in the front of your building near the highway.
But correct me if I'm wrong. The teachers could not participate.
No, they cannot. But by North Carolina law that passed 3 years ago, they must be respectful. So in other words, when the kids are leading the prayer, they need to stand. They can't be over there in a huddle just talking, because they have to show respect and deference to a prayer. They can bow their heads, they can engage in private prayer for themselves, but they cannot get in the middle of it, put their hands on the kids and lead the prayer, or even say, okay, now everybody bow your heads. Or their job is supervisory, but they have to be respectful. They cannot, again, stand over there and be on their cell phone, but their main job is supervision, and as a principal, you must provide that. Whether your teachers want to be out there or not, someone's got to be there to make sure that those kids close to that highway or close to the car traffic in the morning are safe and protected. But yeah, they can't participate.
Okey-dokey.
Now, can you put flyers in the boxes for teachers who may want to go to it? Because, I mean, some might. What do you think, Josh?
No,
I would say no.
you can't do that because the mailboxes are a function of the school, or a function of the state, a function of the school. They belong to us, and we can't disseminate
Right.
just religious paraphernalia.
Excellent. Now you can have an announcement over the intercom that that the students are doing this. I mean, that's the most you can do, as you would about the science club or as you would about parent pickup times and all like that. But you can't endorse it. Neutral. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Josh.
That's okay. So
When I was in Caldwell County, we got hit with this one a lot. There's a group in Hickory, and you all were close enough to Catawba County. There's a group called Freedom from Religion, and they are looking for school districts to take to court and to threaten. And evidently, Caldwell County was a great little target, because I bet on my last 4 years as superintendent, almost every year I had 2 or 3 letters from this group demanding that Caldwell County stop doing something because we were violating this law. Oftentimes we were not, but sometimes when you look into it, yeah, we did cross the line. We were closing our eyes and nodding our head. Yeah, but they're close enough to all of you that and I know Charlotte's got it.
Mhm.
All right, I'm sorry.
So school-sponsored Bible reading is unconstitutional, but then it goes into the Bible may be used as a historical, literary, ethical, or philosophical document when teaching. We'll actually come back to that in just a little bit with Bible history. Prayer at school events, we've already talked about this a little bit. The First Amendment does not prohibit student-initiated private prayer as long as it does not infringe on the rights of others, and it has to be strictly voluntary. And that is the case for athletic events and graduation ceremonies. And we spent a good bit of time this weekend talking about that, where it should not be on the program that there is a prayer. But that a student who is speaking, should he or she decide to go into a prayer, that is okay.
What's the difference between putting it in the program, Josh? Who prints the program?
The school. Therefore, it looks like the school is advocating for a certain religion. Or something. Then it talked a little bit about school board meetings, and this is there wasn't a lot of the things in here. It's contested. And some of the things aren't quite clear. School board meetings, boards that open their meetings with prayer are violating the Establishment Clause. And it talked specifically about how, because the school board meetings oftentimes require students to be present, that's what makes it unconstitutional, but that is heavily contended in courts. And then it referenced like county commission meetings and things like that, where I know Rowan Salisbury, the Rowan County Commission just recently finished a court case where the Supreme Court, or I may be wrong, declared their practice unconstitutional. It
was the Fourth Appeals Court.
Okay, so it was an appeals court. Okay, so it's still pretty high up for Rowan Salisbury. So,
okay, so show of hands, how many of your school boards start with prayer? No one? Now that surprises me. Did they start with a moment of silence?
I think ours starts with just the Pledge of Allegiance, and then they go right into their business.
All right, interesting. Okay. You are right, Josh. The reason why school boards, it's a little harder for school boards is because there is an expectation that kids are there.
Okay, so Dr. Stone, you referenced the next part, and this part was extremely confusing. So please correct me if I'm wrong. But aid to parochial, am I saying that word correctly? Parochial?
Yes.
Schools or religious schools. So there are mixed reviews by the courts regarding this issue. There are several court cases, but generally speaking, the courts allow state support to parochial students when the student is the primary beneficiary of the public service. And then it kind of summarizes what that means. So full tuition reimbursement for parochial students is unconstitutional. Shared educational programs between public and parochial students violates the First Amendment. The state cannot finance or give loans to any facility of a parochial school, but tax deductions are okay. So that does not violate the First Amendment. Free public transportation for those students, that does not violate the First Amendment. And then free textbooks at the state expense for students does not violate the First Amendment. Going back to if it benefits the student, then it's okay at the present moment for the state to support such initiatives.
Not in North Carolina.
I'm sorry?
North Carolina changed about 4 or 5 years ago, so this book is a national book. But in North Carolina, tuition reimbursement, it is, and tuition aid is, of course, declared by the North Carolina Supreme Court to be constitutional. So now you're all correct that, there are certain things that the state, you can't provide buses for private schools. The state can't do loans for private schools to build. But in general, North Carolina has gone totally about 5 years ago to where we are really involved in financing not just the tuition, but also financing private schools in general. And as a taxpayer, I have problems with that, but because I don't know what, and most folks who don't like this do, because you really don't have any safeguards. If it were a private school that had to turn over all their records, had to do all the reporting, were transparent as we were in the public system, it'd be a little different. But there is no accountability in a private parochial religious school, in my opinion. Yes, Josh, that was a good job on that one.
All righty. Okay, so just some basic things which I found interesting. Religious symbols. Schools cannot display religious or exhibits or materials. Teachers may explain or acknowledge various holidays of all cultures, but it must be a secular purpose for knowledge. And teachers should refrain from using specific imagery regarding a specific religion in their classroom when they're teaching in a secular purpose. And basically, it was just kind of this is just a best practice. When you're teaching about Christianity, if you should, don't put a picture of Jesus on the cross. Because that's just a best practice, because you cannot appear that you are biased. You have to remain neutral, which goes back to the beginning slide. Religious displays, it's permissible to have seasonal decorations as they are a reflection of joy and merriment associated with holidays. So, for example, wreaths, bunnies, I think it talks about candy canes, things that are not necessarily affiliated with a specific religion. You don't want to put the nativity out for Christmas, but certainly decorating for the holidays is permissible. The Ten Commandments, it's unconstitutional to post the Ten Commandments in public schools. It did go in that there's a huge argument about other governmental buildings, but it is pretty specific that the Ten Commandments should not be in public schools. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Stone, unless it's painted in a mural that is associated with history.
Yes.
Not a secular, you should believe in God type of mural.
Right. It can't stand alone for the purpose of prophesizing.
Okay. Religious mottos and expressions, "In God we trust," is basically what that was centered around. So that's currently acceptable in schools as it is a motto of the country. Most state courts have ruled in favor of that, but encourage appropriate displays that it's in context with our nation's history. But this issue has not been heard at the Supreme Court level. And the way the chapter was written, it seems that could happen. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it has made it up higher since this book was written, right? I don't know if it's been a Supreme Court.
I believe it has, but I don't believe the Supreme Court has ruled on it yet. That would be a big one. We would know that. So it's probably just sitting there someplace in an appeals court.
Right.
Look, let me ask a couple questions on this, and not just Josh. Someone else jump in. When we call you by name, Shamika, can you in your office have a cross on the wall? Right. When I walk in your office, is there this huge cross up above you?
Yes, as long as that is not causing any, I should say, adverse feelings in terms of what the cross is saying. But yes.
Okay, well, can I offer a different opinion? I would say that's probably the first time somebody who wants to get you in trouble, that's probably where they're going to go. Now, if you had it in a display of the Jewish cross, the crescent moon, and the other religious displays, and it was obvious that you weren't just picking one out of the 10 and saying, this is that I believe in. So if you're going to have the cross, probably the best thing would be to do is to have it in your desk drawer so you can pull it out and look at it, or you can wear it around your necklace. But I would be very careful about one particular symbol that's particularly associated with one religion than having that up there. And I dare say that you could probably, in Charlotte Mech or here in the South, you could probably get by with it. But technically, if someone came in, you would probably get in some trouble. I mean, I know you could get in trouble because you are a state employee, and what you're doing, or a government official, and what you're doing when they walk in is you are saying, yep, this is what I believe, and I'm the boss lady here, so you should probably take notice of that. All right. I just a suggestion. You might want to check with your boss. Shante, you with me? Can you have a symbol of the fish on your car when you go to work? Park in the parking lot? You know the symbol of the fish for Christianity?
I guess not. I don't. I don't know.
Yes, you can. That's your private vehicle, and you can do that. You can have a symbol. You can have a symbol of communism. You can have a symbol on your car because that's your private vehicle, and that is not you in your government capacity. Most of these things really do apply to you in your government capacity. You are the government. And so, Shamika, when they walk into your office and they see this huge big old cross up here, they are seeing the government presenting this cross. They're not, you are the government, but your car is not the government, Shamika. Shante.
Well, when it's political, you can't do it if you're doing a party. Like if I want to vote for Obama, you can't put that on your car. But you can, so is that different?
You can. That's your First Amendment right. Now, you can't put it up in your room where you are the government official. You couldn't put it up in your room unless it's in a series of others, whomever. But yes, if it's on your car, that's your freedom of your First Amendment freedom, and you can do that. Now, you can't say some really ugly things about Donald Trump because that's disruptive. But vote for Obama is not a disruptive sign. But if you say something really, really ugly about Trump, and it could be cause of disruption or somebody may come by, that's a different story. But just because, and you can also wear that little cross around your neck. You can also carry your Bible in your book bag. You can put your Bible in your desk, probably not on your desk, because you still don't lose your First Amendment rights when you come into that building. But if you ever have a question, I would certainly just think of it from this perspective. When somebody sees me, are they seeing me as a government official, or are they seeing me as a private citizen? Because when you're
they don't see us as private citizens much when we're educators.
They don't do that. All right. Anybody else got another example you want to ask? Because it's really quite interesting. And honestly and truly, in the South, we get by with a lot of stuff because we are in the South and nobody's challenged us. We're in communities that are 99% Christian and nobody's challenged us because that's just the way we've always done it. But that's just not necessarily the way it is. Anybody else have a particular one? If not, we'll let Josh. And this, in God we trust, almost every courthouse in the state of North Carolina, I don't know about South Carolina, but almost every courthouse now has that on us. But you try to put one in front of your central office and see where you go. Or put one in front of your school if it's not a part of the wall that you have in your central office that's devoted to the American Constitution, to the Bill of Rights. I mean, you can put it there because it's a part of a historical context, as Josh said. But you put that in God We Trust above one of your schools, let me know how long you worked there. All right. Josh, I'm holding you up.
That's all right. Next, talked about school facilities. And I learned some terminology here, the terms open forum and closed forum. So a school that has created a limited open forum cannot deny access to student-initiated groups on the basis of religion, political, or philosophical content of their speech. So basically, if you allow one group, you have to allow all groups. That's an open forum. You're allowing students to express themselves in the formation of groups or clubs or just individually, so to speak. So that's what it says. An open forum is when an administrator allows student groups to meet on campus during non-instructional time. If I just said that if one group meets, they all do. And then schools may ban clubs if the school practices a closed forum. Am I correct in saying that?
You are. How many of you have an open forum at your schools?
I would say we do. I don't think it's as big of a deal at the elementary level. I know our high school does.
Do you have clubs at the elementary level?
We got a running club.
Oh, you got a club. You got an open forum then.
Okay, so open forum, yep.
Every one of you have an open forum if you have one club, which means that now there's a difference here in that your running club is sure unless it's tied to your PE curriculum somehow or another, it's really not a curriculum related club. So you may get in a little bit more danger if someone wants to come in and do some other kind of club because you've allowed something that's not clearly tied to your curriculum. So I would suggest, Josh, you go back and look at the history, or you go back and look at the charter or whatever kind of documents you have on that club and definitely tie them into your curriculum. Because if you don't, then you really have created a very, very open forum.
Good to know.
And an open forum means that anybody can use it. So any of your clubs, like your French club, your Spanish club, those are all curriculum related. How many of you have a Young Democrat in the high school club? Do any of you have that? Or Young Republican club or something like that? Well, if you do, that's an open forum too. You're opening yourself for the Young Wiccan, or if you have student, what is it called? The FAC, Fellowship of Christian FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Because it's tied to athletics, which is a curricular program, you're probably safe. But if you just had Christian, you're a Christian club or a Bible club, and you don't teach Bible, you probably open yourself up to a Wiccan club if they ever want to create one, or other clubs that could come along the way. So be very careful. But pretty much all of us have an open club, an open forum. So be careful to make sure that every club you have is related in some way to your curriculum. And I'd go back and look at your documentation that created that club, or the Constitution, or whatever the permission for that club, and revise it to make sure that it is curriculum tied. Therefore, you can kind of, when the next group comes in, wants to come in, but if they're not curriculum tied, you can deny it because you don't have that open forum for the community. Okay.
Okay. So then going into the use of school facilities from outside organizations or religious organizations, it goes back to that open or closed forum idea. So if a school district practices an open forum regarding their facilities, the district must remain neutral in approving the use by all community groups. School officials may not permit public groups to use the school facility during during non-instructional hours, as long as it does not interfere with the normal operations. They have the authority to determine whether they will practice an open or closed forum regarding school facilities. All right. So then going into teaching religion in schools. So holiday programs, public schools may not celebrate religious holidays. Programs may have religious content, but it must be secular. It must serve an educational purpose. And then religious music can be performed by bands or choirs as entertainment, but not in a devotional setting. So you can't call them to worship, but you can certainly sing certain religious songs in a historical content or in a musical content or context.
Like your Christmas, not Christmas, but your what would you call it then? I guess your Christmas concert or your fall concert. You can have religious music all you want, as long as it's like an old-timey or something that's a part of our culture. But you can't do it you can't do it just for the religious song purpose.
Okay. We talked about this a little bit.
Go ahead.
gospel choirs? What about those? I know some high schools have gospel choirs. It's like a chorus, but they sing gospel music. What does that fall?
I think the gospel music is probably a part. I think it's illegal, and I would say it's legal because it's a part of that one. It's a school activity, and it's really they're singing songs that are part of the culture of your school or part of the culture of our community here in the South. I think they're legal.
Okay.
So teaching the Bible may be taught in public schools as a part of the school's curriculum if it is not associated with any form of worship and it is taught objectively. It talked a lot in that part about like the Bible history courses and that those are perfectly okay as long as they are objective and they're not biased toward that religion or toward Christianity. Then this was the most confusing part of the chapter, and it was the argument of teaching intelligent design and then the theory of evolution. So this is what I got out of it. Intelligent design violates the separation of church and state, specifically the establishment clause due to its religious connotation, and that the theory of evolution being taught in schools is left to the discretion of the school board.
All right, let's play with this, Josh. Why do you think that? What's intelligent design? What's the theory of intelligent design? Anybody?
That we were created by one creator, one person, or one.
Right. It's pretty much the biblical 7 days. It's pretty much what we were taught as children and are still taught, that the world was created by God. He put it in place. So it's pretty much the religious perception of that's how creation. It's a rejection of evolution. It's saying God, that we didn't evolve from monkeys. God created man. It's the complete opposite of evolution. And evolution is based in science, whereas intelligent design is really based more in faith. And that's why, because intelligent design is based in our personal faith, that's why we can't. Violates the separation of church and state. Whereas the theory of evolution, whether you believe it or not, is based in some scientific theory. And so it can be taught. And I don't know of many school districts that don't teach evolution. I mean, I can't imagine a science curriculum that doesn't have evolution in it. I would be very surprised to hear intelligent design taught, but I will probably also not be surprised to know that it's probably discussed, but not taught, because you can use it as a contrast. Here's the theory of evolution. Here's what science says. But by the way, there's another theory out there, which is intelligent design. You just can't teach it, but you can kind of touch on it as a contrast.
And there was also a good bit, and Shantae might know about this, but in Georgia, apparently they went through a phase of where they started putting stickers on their textbooks, specific because the textbook did not say that evolution was a theory. I could be saying this wrong, but so the state issued stickers to put on the science textbook saying that in this book it does talk about the theory of evolution, but then that whole sticker thing went to the courts, and eventually they ruled that those stickers should not be on the book. So this is where the court cases and that process was very, very confusing to understand. So you did a much better job of explaining it. Distribution of religious materials. We also talked a little bit about this over the weekend. Public school personnel are not permitted to distribute religious materials on school grounds because it makes them look biased and it interferes with their neutrality. Public school officials may not allow religious groups to come into the schools to distribute religious materials. Schools, again, must remain neutral. In an open forum, religious materials may be available as if they're like sitting out on a table or in their bin with pamphlets and flyers, where you have several pamphlets and flyers, but may not be promoted by that group or a particular individual. If one group gets to make items available, then all groups must be able to make items available. So if you have a table set out for Bibles, then if someone comes up and says they want to set out a table of Qurans, then or Torahs or any other religious document, you must give them the opportunity to do that as well.
Do any of you allow the Gideons in your elementary schools? The Gideons? We used to do all the Gideons used to just have all the time. Did you all get the little Bible when you were in elementary school? The little green Bible, or was it red or white? That's from the Gideons. They used to give out Bibles, and they still do it. But they, like Josh said, they have to They can't stand there and say, if you don't, here's how to believe in Christ, here's how to be saved. But they can put them out on a table and kids can walk by and decide whether or not to pick them up. But if you do that, you got that open forum.
All right, my last slide, the Pledge of Allegiance. So this was another one that was pretty lengthy, but at the end of the day, students may not be compelled to recite the Pledge of Allegiance based on their right to freedom of expression. So we cannot force a student to say the Pledge of Allegiance. We must give them the opportunity to opt out, but they can't be disrespectful to the environment when students are saying the pledge.
Right.
So you asked a couple of questions about the next two. So briefly, religious rights of teachers in school. Teachers can informally engage in religious speech with their colleagues when teachers are allowed to congregate or meet. So you could talk about that with a colleague in the teacher's lounge, or while you're walking down the hallway, or you're walking to your car, or you're walking into the building. But they cannot occur where students can observe or participate. That should say, cannot observe or participate. And then teachers and religious garb. So most states have statutes that prohibit public school teachers from wearing religious garb in the classroom. Teachers cannot exercise their belief through dress during the period of day in which they are employed. A teacher is free to exercise full religious rights and freedoms outside normal hours of employment. I think that this is where you even mentioned it, that because we live in the South, this is the one that we take the most advantage of, so to speak, if that's the right way to phrase that. But it was very common to walk into a classroom when I was in high school and to see a whole corner devoted to Jesus Christ behind the teacher's desk, so to speak. But according to this book, that should not happen.
Right, as long as it's a prominent. Now that little cross you wear and it kind of goes between your shirt or something, that's okay, because it's not something you're throwing out there at people.
Right.
All right.
Josh, what about headwear?
Well, that's what I was just going to say. That's becoming, much more prevalent. I mean, if you look at Congress, we have two congresswomen who wear there's a term for that. I'm sorry, it's slipped my mind. What's that called?
Hajiba or Hai something?
Yes, that. If let's just say we hired someone who wore that traditional garb, would they be allowed to wear that in the classroom? Or do we say, no, you can't? Based off of what this book is saying, probably not. But if we allow if we're allowed to wear crosses as necklaces.
Yeah, I think that ultimately that will make its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will rule that people can, because the headdress and that is such an integral part of their religion. It's not like that is preaching. It's not like that. You could say it is, but I think the court's going to have to weigh on that. But I would be leery of denying someone the opportunity to do that.
All right.
I would be leery. I'd talk to my lawyer to see how far you want to go.
We actually had a teacher at my school when I was a beginning teacher who actually wore the full Arab outfit.
Yeah.
And she was allowed to do it. There wasn't really much pushback, but we did have a couple parents that tried to push back on it. But she was able to wear it. So that's just my experience.
Yeah. And Daryl, I think that goes back to the point of, I think it's going to depend on what school. You're in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which is a little bit more accepting and understanding of different values, but you put someone in a traditional dress like that in very rural, very Christian community, I think you're going to have a lot more problems.
A lot more pushback, yes.
Yeah.
All right.
So my last question, and this is what I kind of thought about the whole time I was reading this chapter, is our school and our districts really separating church and state? Because some of this stuff, I found myself looking around my office to see if I was violating something as I was reading this. So,
all right, that's a good spot to leave. We're going a bit in the interest of time, Josh. That's something for you wanting to sleep on tonight.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a real quick break, and we're going to come back with Shamika. Are you going to be ready? All right, let's take about a 3-minute break. Good job, Josh. Sorry to interrupt so much.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. That one was a lot.
One of my favorite topics. All right. And Shamika,
Yeah, yes, can you hear me?
you want to put the cross in your office? That's okay. Just be
Okay.
careful. Just take it down when an administrator comes in, because you might get in a little trouble.
Okay, I'll make sure it's a very small one.
Kind of hide it behind your desk. All right. We're gonna start back. I know some of you are still not with us yet, but we're gonna start back for the interest of time. I want to close because this is really one of my favorite. The chapter Josh did is one of my favorite because it is one of the most evolving things or issues that are going to be confronting you as a school administrator. And any time that you have an issue of this, whether you're the principal or you're in the central office or something, or even when you're a superintendent, the first place you need to go is to ask the superintendent's office advice. If someone comes to your office and challenges you on an issue of religion, I would suggest that you immediately let the superintendent's office know, because it's not going to stop there. Religion is something that people take very seriously. It's an important part of their lives. And because it's serious to them, they sometimes don't quite understand when those of us in the public setting don't take it as serious, because we can't. And again, very, very much so, I would take it to my superintendent first. And then if you are superintendent and you have these questions come up, I would take it to my school board attorney, because your advice from your school board attorney may save you some skin in the game a little bit later on. Because if your lawyer advises you to do something, you can go ahead and do it. It's the lawyer who gets in trouble. Now, if your conscience tells you it's wrong, you shouldn't, of course, but it'll fall back on the lawyer because you've been acting on good faith on the advice of your attorney. And you will find also in talking to your superintendents, you may get a different perspective, a different answer. Shamika may get a completely different answer from her superintendent. I doubt in Charlotte Meck, but if she were in a small district like one down east, Shamika may get a completely different answer from her superintendent about the cross in her room. Because even as superintendents, we remember most of us are older folks, and we've been doing it this way forever and a day, and it's only recently that we've had these really strong challenges to religion in the schools. And so even a superintendent may, turn the eye and say, okay, go ahead, or we'll wait until we get caught. So, but I would recommend that you err on the side of caution when it comes to religion, sex, and politics. All right. Shamika, chapter 3, if you want to go down and share.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I had chapter 3, student rights and restrictions. This was a rather lengthy chapter, but very good information. I can advance my slide. Wait a minute. Sorry. Let's see if I can make this smaller. Well, there we go. Okay, so I kind of broken my PowerPoint down into about 5 main issues. So I'll talk about the legal rights of students, the responsibilities that officials have towards them, school issues, domestic issues, consequential actions, some takeaways, and then we'll discuss a few of the statements that were given in case studies. All right, so this book, a chapter in the book really started out talking about freedom of expression and the First Amendment rights of students. A lot of this was really defined by the 1960 Tinker versus Des Moines case. And of course, We're kind of familiar with that now from this past weekend, but excuse me, it was the case where you had your students that were protesting the Vietnam policy in the 60s and were wearing the armbands. And so from this, we have to, as officials, know that students have the right to protest as long as there is only minor disruption, and that we have an actual procedure that gives students an option of how to go about protesting, and provide them an opportunity to do that. So we must have justifiable and legitimate reason if we're going to provide any type of restriction, not just of student voice, but also if we're going to administer any consequence for whether that be student dress, which we'll get to, or cell phones or things of that nature. It must be fair and reasonable. So another example was given, of course, we're familiar with the Bethel versus Frazier with the student speech as well. We talked a little bit about that this weekend, but as officials, you must have the ability to control material that is deemed disruptive, indecent, or offensive, which may violate school rules or destruction of school property as a result, disregard for authority. So this is kind of how the book defined what rights we have as officials to begin to assert the due process, which is really the split between school and domestic issues. So due process is basically what this chapter 3 really hounded. Although it was a smaller section of all the other things that was discussed, it was really, really emphasized in every example that was given, and that's that we have to make sure that due process is followed. Some of the issues that we come across as school officials would be, of course, abuse situations and the reporting of that, which a lot of our schools districts have policies for Title IX. There was a landmark case for that. It was the Evans versus Antioch School District in California, which there was a special ed teacher that was allegedly abusing a student by smacking him with the back of the hand, pinching a student. Other officials in the school knew about it. No one reported it, and so that court decided that the school district had to pay $8 million for that. So that was one example. The thing that we have to keep in mind, and I'll get to due process, the two categories of that in just a moment, but we must always, always, always exercise the right to giving students an opportunity to offer their side of the story before we begin any type of punitive consequential action that will, and just so many words come back to bite us in the end. There are some other cases that was stated in this chapter in regards to abuse, which I found very interesting. One in particular, Judge Sandra Day O'Connor gave a definition for how we are to look at girls when it comes to sexual harassment in a classroom, if it's student to student. There were two girls in Florida that were being harassed by a young man in that school. And basically, even though the girls were being taunted and they were being just really, I guess I could say they were not just being taunted, but they were actually being touched as well. The report stated that. Judge O'Connor says that there must be an action that is going to either be defined by assault or battery, and it has to impede a student's ability to have access to an equal education. So there was a dissenting decision in a 5-4 sort of holding of this, which deliberate indifference is given to student being two girls versus there's a 6-year-old little boy that got suspended for kissing a girl for 2 days, but then of course that got reversed in terms of his expulsion, and it became a misconduct action. So things that we just have to be very careful about when it comes to abuse and sexual harassment. Cell devices, the court has not made any definitive decisions about how cell phone devices should be handled in the classroom. The only thing that the court says at the Supreme Court level, and this was, I think, Justice Roberts, it stated that they should not prohibit, or I should say, they shouldn't promote conducive learning, and in that the cell phone devices should prohibit disruptive influence. And so that's the decision that was made about that. Dress and appearance, basically there's some court cases in this chapter that address that topic, and the courts have ruled in favor of school districts with just knowing that safety, health, and undue attention is something that you want to look for as a school official, and that there's a burden of proof that school officials are responsible for in all areas, which basically states that we must provide environments that are orderly and peaceful, and that goes back to our protests as well, and that we have to act in a fair and reasonable way. Some other domestic issues discussed in this chapter were pregnant and married students, which I found very interesting. Pregnant students and married students are permitted to attend school, and school officials are not permitted to force them to learn at home. But if a doctor provides a written notice that requests that the student go out on medical leave, then once the student, who may be married or not but is pregnant, has the child or gives birth, then that student is permitted to return to school. If the student is married, then married students are permitted to come to school. And one thing that they are not, they do not have to be held under the same parental guidelines as a traditional student. But married students, because they are married, have the freedom to escape the parental rights and act on their own merit, which means they can choose to attend school whenever they feel is necessary for them. So I found that to be interesting as well. Okay, so legal responsibilities. Again, this word fairness and reasonable keeps coming up, and we have to remember that we must be both and exercising both. There's two separate categories for due process, and this is really protected by the 14th Amendment in the Constitution. States were given the right, I think Josh spoke a little bit about that in his presentation, they're given the right to ensure that we are protecting students at the state level. That's the 5th Amendment, but then the due process comes in at the 14th Amendment. So there's two separate parts to this. There's procedural and then there's substantive. Basically, procedural due process just states that we must give students the opportunity to seek redress for any alleged violations or incidents that they are being charged with. So there's some differences that come into play with that when we look at suspension versus expulsion, and we'll look at the chart in just a minute with that. But then there's substantial due process that basically outlines procedures and substance, which means that there must be clearly defined procedures that are followed for any charges that are brought against any student for any reason. So some examples for due process and legal responsibilities would be looking at the search and seizure policies that we have, the drug and alcohol testing. There are a couple of policies that were mentioned, cases that were mentioned in reference to discipline in the book under due process. For the search and seizure, the key word to remember is reasonable suspicion. So there were a couple of cases outlined in the chapter that spoke about most law enforcement when they come into the school district, they sort of take on the responsibility of heading an investigation if there is a criminal act that has been reported. However, if on a classroom level, a teacher has reasonable suspicion that there is a need for a search, then of course that is reported, and then the school official handles that situation based on the fact that there has been evidence spotted or someone has reported to a teacher or an official that something has been passed along or handled. So reasonable suspicion is the key term here, and it doesn't necessarily mean that a warrant has to be issued, because that's different from residential versus school property. And so police do not need a warrant because students maintain their constitutional rights even at the schoolhouse door. So for drug and alcohol testing, there is individualized suspicion. So there was a case in the chapter that spoke about students being searched as a group versus an individual. And so the individualized suspicion means that it's dealing with a person aside from an entire group. So one of the cases spoke about a student that had, or a teacher that asserted that a student smelled like marijuana. And so that student was searched. The marijuana was actually in the student's wallet. And so the court held that the school didn't have a right to search his wallet, but that the school did have the right to search the student, his person, but not his wallet. So I found that to be interesting.
Can I add something real quick, Shamika?
Sure.
Okay. One of the things that because we talked about when you have to report to law enforcement, and that's why it's important that you do report circumstances to them. But remember, as Shamika mentioned here, under due process, you as a school official are not held to the same high standard that a law enforcement officer is. You just have a reasonable suspicion. Somebody could come in the office and tell you that Steve Stone's got a knife on him. That is enough suspicion for you to go and to not make me strip to search me, but to search my bag, to search my locker, to search and to ask me to empty my pockets. Now, a law enforcement officer is going to need a little bit more than that. And so that's why oftentimes you have a lot more authority over students when they come in through your door than a law enforcement officer. You can do certain things as your standard is a little bit lower. And therefore, you have the opportunity to really make kids comply more so than law enforcement, as long as you don't have to have the same level of threat. You don't have to have the same level of suspicion. So just remember that. And I want to add this one, what Shamika said several times, and this is a point that I think all of us in administration need to know, is that most of the cases that we as school systems lose, it's not because we gave the wrong punishment. It's because we didn't follow our policies and we didn't do due process. We called those kids in and immediately didn't even give them a chance to tell their side of the story. Bam, 3 days out of school suspension, don't want to hear it. Have you ever had an administrator like that? The kids come in, don't have time for it, I don't want to hear it. 3 days home. That is not due process. And if that makes its way through a court case, I mean, you could sit there for 1 minute and have them write down their what happened or their side, but they've got to have that opportunity. And that's when we lose most of our cases, when we have not followed our own policies or our own due process. We lose a lot of cases. And most of these cases that make it to court, it's really not about the punishment the kid got. It's the fact that we didn't give them due process or follow the procedures. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, and so with that, there are two landmark cases that speak to due process or the lack thereof, and it was the Galt versus Arizona in 1967, where a student made an obscene phone call and he was reprimanded, but the student was not given a written appeal, he wasn't given a written notification, and the student also wasn't given the opportunity to protect himself in terms of giving his side of the story. He was just suspended. So That was one case. And then, of course, we know about the Goss versus Lopez in Ohio. We talked about that this weekend, about the students in the cafeteria and how they were reprimanded for the confrontations in the cafeteria. So there is a difference between taking action that is, an official that is pursuing a compelling act, and then making sure that it's necessary to achieve whatever action that you're taking against a student. Those are two things that are outlined in a substantive due process. And so we have to make sure that that is the case always. That being said, we are looking at a chart, table 3.2, and this was taken off of, I believe, page 83. And there's a difference between the steps that are taken for suspension versus expulsion. Suspension being anything be less than 10 days. Expulsion, of course, the student is removed from the facility or even the district. What is interesting about the suspension and the expulsion is that the courts have no provision for suspensions that occur beyond 10 days. And so there hasn't been really any decisions about that, but we do have procedures for suspensions versus expulsions when it's less than 10 days for suspension. And of course, like I said, removal with expulsion. So that brings us to the consequential actions. There are some landmark cases with corporal punishment that were discussed, the Ingram versus Wright and the Baker versus Owen cases, in which the student, with Ingram versus Wright, the student was paddled for throwing, I believe it was a kickball, and it wasn't during the assigned playtime. So the kid was paddled. We talked a bit about that this weekend. I'm sorry, that was the Baker versus Owen case. So in the Ingram versus Wright, that student was paddled, and I believe the parent had an issue with the number of licks. The student received 20 licks in that case. So the word here is a rudimentary due process, which means that we must always inform the parents of the alleged incident. We have to give an option in our corporal punishment for the districts that will allow that. I believe there are 20 states that still allow for corporal punishment. North Carolina and South Carolina are both two of those states. But it's really decided by the district in terms of whether or not that policy is going to be carried. But rudimentary due process should be that we should always inform the parent, warn the student before we take action for corporal punishment, tell them what they did wrong, and never allow that punishment to be excessive or malicious when we're providing it. And it should always be the last resort after you have shown that there have been efforts made to resolve the issue before corporal punishment takes place. So with that, we have, I think there's 8 steps here that we should take in terms of corporal punishment and exerting that against a student, especially on the expulsion side. The student, parent, guardian, the student and his or her parent guardian should be given notice of those charges, and that notice should occur written preferably, and that should occur before the hearing. And the difference, I think, one of the differences between talking about suspensions and expulsions is that when you're talking about a suspension, the hearing could actually be informal, and the hearing could just simply be the student given an opportunity to say what happened. But with expulsion, of course, this could lead to an actual official hearing of district officials. The student with expulsion has to have a right to legal counsel and have to have a hearing before impartial parties. There must be an option for a supportive witness to attend that hearing. That student must receive a fair hearing, which means cross-examination, the student receiving the right even to testify on their own behalf, and also a right to the transcript once it reaches that level. So those things are very important when we're talking about disciplining our students. Also, along those lines, again, I stated that any type of punishment that is exerted against a student must not be malicious, and it must not be excessive. Excessive being defined by causing bodily harm to another. That's actually the battery, but the assault is the intention of one to cause that harm. That the person must have potential to do so, but the battery is actually when contact is made and harm has occurred. An example of this was given in a case with Fulton County, Georgia, versus Neal and Griffin. So Neal was a student athlete, and Griffin was sort of taunting Neal, and Neal decided to take a lock weight out of his book bag and hit Griffin in the head. And the principal as well as the coach saw the two students fighting. They did not try to stop the fight. They did not try to correct that action. So then the coach said that Neal deserved to receive the same type of punishment for the action that he'd shown. So the coach then took the lock weight out of, he dumped Neal's bag out. He was asking Neal, what did he hit the other student with? Then he saw the lock weight on the ground, picked up the lock weight. He hit Neal in the face, the left eye, and Neal's left eye came out of the socket. Neal received permanent eye damage because of that. And the district court, which was interesting, held for the school district in this case, but then the circuit court overturned and held for the plaintiff. And I just thought that was interesting that the district court would hold for the school district in that case. And then also one other topic for this chapter was about off-campus behavior and how we should handle that with due process. Off-campus behavior is protected as a school official's right. And the case that was named in the chapter for this one was the Burdick versus Arkansas Board of Education, in which a student was drunk in the streets on Christmas Day. The board held that even though the student was not at school, that the student is represents the school, and because the student was drunk, then the court held for the school to suspend the student. So even off-campus behavior is within the school official's right to discipline a student. We just have to make sure there's an adequate notice of infraction. Again, there's an opportunity for the informal hearing, but the evidence of notice is given opportunity for the student to refute the charges. That written notice is provided to the parent by mail, but also that the parent or guardian is phoned about the suspicion. Another example they gave in this was the Sherrill versus Indiana case, where there was a student in Indianapolis that just basically said that he was going to shoot up the school. And in this case, the court held for the school district that student could be expelled because it involved the threat of a gun, which would put that under a violation for expulsion versus suspension. So here's some takeaways that I have from this chapter. One of the most important things that keeps coming to mind as we go through this text is know your landmark cases and how they're going to define some of the policies that your district has adopted, or even some policies that you may want to create. You want to make sure you know very well the landmark cases, and then make sure that all of your decisions are supported with evidence, and you have documentation for that. Always allow your students the benefit of the doubt, or to explain his or her own side of what happened. Make sure we're notifying our parents and guardians of the steps for our process and all of our actions that were taken against our students, or even for our students. Also, another thing that I didn't put in the takeaways, but I just thought about, is that the stakeholders should be involved in policies that that speak to the discipline actions of students, especially when it comes to expulsions. Stakeholders and individual members from the community should also have a hand in creating those policies at the district level. Always remember to document and be careful to ensure, or this is my question just for you to think about before we move into the discussions. Are you always careful to ensure that your decisions are lawful when it comes to strategically leading others? That being said, there were so many different case study examples in this chapter, but I just wanted to focus on one or two of them and ask for the class participation in this. Tell me, in each one of these cases, what would your action be? Do you think that the action is legal or not, in terms of how you would explain your answer? So I'll just pick two of the three that I have there. Students who protest the poor treatment of teachers and faculty members. And by the way, these questions can be found, I believe it's on page 95 to 97. Sorry, 97 and 99. So if you're looking at, yes.
In the interest of time, because we do have one more presentation we want to do tonight, would you mind if we kind of leave this like we did with Josh?
Sure.
Leave it with folks to think about, because I think the PowerPoint, the page you had before this, really, if you flip back to it real quickly,
Sure.
That's the real power of this, is to make sure that you are following these. If you can go back one slide, make sure you're following these things. And I apologize, but evidently
no, it's fine.
Too much, giving you all not enough time to do your presentations. So I apologize for that, but if that's okay, Lenora, you want to go ahead and get started. But these are the kinds of things, make sure you follow.
Yeah,
Lenora, are you okay with doing it? Thank you, Shamika.
You're welcome.
If you'll just stop sharing. And Lenora, I don't want to rush you, take your time, but it's all yours.
Okay, thank you much.
Thank you, Shamika.
You're welcome.
So the good news is that my chapter was very redundant. Many of the things that Shamika talked about were also discussed in my chapter. My chapter was 4, and it basically talked about school policies and legislation through the lens of national security and school safety. And I really don't want to shortchange the chapter, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip along. And I hope you all don't mind. If you want to talk with me later, I'll be more than happy to talk with you at length about all of this stuff. So, national security and school safety. Basically, these 3 types of legislation have a big impact on school safety. We've got Homeland Security, the USA Patriot Act, and the No Child Left Behind Act, which we're all familiar with No Child Left Behind, but it actually had, I was surprised to find out that it had a big school safety component as well. So what do we need to know about the Homeland Security Act? Basically, it came about after 9/11, and I've got something in front of my thing and I can't even read what my own thing says, but it basically provided guidelines that the U.S. can use to design a new terrorist alert system. We know about the Code Orange or the Code Yellow alert system, and that's basically what that did. That came about in 2002 from President George W. Bush. And then later we had the the USA Patriot Act that was enacted after 9/11 again in 2001. And basically it authorized U.S. law authorities to investigate and try to preempt any potential terrorist threat or terrorist acts, not only in the United States, but also around the world. This means that for us, for schools, that schools can disclose personally identifiable information without consent of parents or without consent of students to the FBI. This act removed the stipulation that records sought be those of someone who's under suspicion. So you don't even have to be named and be under suspicion, and the FBI can still have access to your information. And then lastly, the No Child Left Behind and School Safety Act basically created an organization called the National School Safety Center. And what they did is they developed a whole bunch of guidelines that were supposed to help schools be safe. And, you know, we talked about a couple of classes ago, if you really want to know what's important in policy, then you really need to look at the budget. And this was school safety was so important that the Secretary of Education actually set aside $30 million to help schools be able to fight against unsafe measures. This happened in 2003. So there were a bunch of guidelines that were developed that that schools are supposed to be using in order for us to be safe. They include they include these things here that you see. Number one, our school mission statement must include the context for which we want to accomplish our goals. What does that mean? In most schools' mission and vision statements, it says something like this. Students will be able to learn in a safe and secure environment. That all came about because of these guidelines. And that was something that I didn't know. Second guideline is that we need to be able to, or that we should have a series of threat assessment protocol. And we need not ignore the fact that often our students are our best source of information whenever there's a threat, a potential threat to the school. And we should probably consider having, creating something like a tip line where kids can call in and report a potential threat. A third,
they're required for districts. I'm pretty sure for a district, it's required to have it.
Okay. A third guideline established by this organization is that we need to be able to identify potential disasters that could occur based on where our schools are located. Are you near a railroad track? Is there a potential for there to be chemical spills or utility failures? If so, you need to be aware of that and plan accordingly. You also need to consider controlling your campus access points. As much as possible, you want to try to minimize the number of entrances and exit points that you have to your campus. And these entrances and exits need to be supervised as much as possible. Think about putting up perimeter fencing, having extra supervision in your bus lot, your cleaning closets, the roofs of your school. All of these areas need to be secure. The next guideline is assigning roles and responsibilities to your staff so that they can monitor hallways, patrol parking lots, supervise at before and after school events, et cetera, et cetera. Another guideline is if you do have an emergency, you need to know before the emergency who you need to call. So have the phone numbers to your emergency responders, have a relationship with your local law enforcement officers, and be ready to contact your mental health professionals because they're going to need to help you in time of a crisis. And then another guideline that they developed is that they reminded us that cultural awareness and sensitivity training are important because all of these things, cultures, they influence the kinds of information, the strategies, and the resources that we're going to put out or that we're going to develop. So don't ignore it. And then if you do have an emergency, you need to have an emergency communication system. How are you going to get in contact with people? Are you going to use intercoms on your campus, two-way radios, or are you going to use cell phones? And then finally, the last guideline that they talked about is being able to implement a uniform crime reporting and record keeping system. If crimes are not being reported or they're being reported in different manners and you're unaware of what's going on, then you can't be proactive. So knowing what the crimes are will give you the power so that you can plan accordingly. And then they came up with a bunch of procedures for evaluating and responding to threats. Developing a school safety program, having a team put together, listing all of your safety threats. Always, always, always follow up on leads, because you don't want to be the one who is negligent because you didn't follow up on something. Another procedure is to develop and implement district policies for those students that are whose behavior poses a safety threat to the school. Solicit assistance from parents. Develop strategies so that you can minimize or at best eliminate threats altogether. Again, you need to elicit the assistance of your local law enforcement officials. And then also think about the fact that the people who are being disruptive or who are threats need counseling. So be prepared to provide offenders with counseling or anger management. And then also think about the fact that sometimes people do things because they don't feel successful in school. So think about giving them opportunities to be successful in school, because that may prevent some things. Another guideline is to act decisively whenever you're dealing with offenders. Don't be wishy-washy. Provide comprehensive and ongoing training for your staff, and then try to create an environment of trust and that permeates your school culture so that people will feel free or feel like they can come and tell you things that need to be disclosed. So then this gets into what I think is the best part of the chapter. They start talking, the author starts talking specifically about how to handle school violence, freedom of expression, zero tolerance policy, and then using metal detectors in the school. So in terms of hazing, let me back up for a moment and just say this. As Shamika said in her chapter, students are afforded constitutional protections under the First Amendment, and students are afforded constitutional protections against infringement of these rights unless school officials can demonstrate that they have a legitimate need to restrict student rights. So she talked a lot about the Tinker case, and so you can, as long as you're acting in good faith to keep schools and your kids safe, you can, I don't want to say infringe upon their rights, but you can infringe upon their rights in order to keep people safe. You just have to make sure that you're being reasonable, as she quoted. So what are some instances where you need to keep people safe? Let's talk about hazing. What is hazing? Hazing is, we all know what hazing is. And the big thing there is if you have a sense that hazing is going on, then that means that you have the ability to foresee that your students are going to be threatened by that their safety is going to be threatened by it, and you have got to act prudently. You have got to be swift and prompt, and you have got to eliminate that hazing, because if you don't, you're going to be negligent if somebody gets hurt. And then the book went into a lot of guidelines that you need to implement in order to deal with hazing. And I won't, for time's sake, go into what all those guidelines are. The next big area they talked about was bullying. We all know what bullying is. There's some really good information, a very detailed about bullying, what it is and what it isn't in this chapter. So if you have time, take a minute to look at it. The thing that was most surprising to me is that if you, and I didn't know this, if you are 12 or older, you can be charged criminally in a court of law if you are found to be bullying. Then again, there are lots of guidelines that were established about bullying, and I won't go into talking about what all those are because of time's sake. The next thing that we talked about in the chapter was cyberbullying. What is it? What does it include? And then they gave some really disheartening and very sad examples of people who have kids who have been cyberbullied, who hanged themselves or committed suicide in different fashions, shot themselves, etc. So cyberbullying and bullying is very prevalent, and it can be detrimental. And we have a responsibility as school leaders to do all that we can to protect kids. Examples of that, the Jeffrey Johnston Stand Up for All Kids Act. This was an example that was presented about an honors kid who hung himself because he was being bullied. Again, the big thing here is just make sure that you're not negligent. When you are aware of something, you have got to act. Yep. And then the last thing on this slide talked about the fact that, and I think someone mentioned this the other day, is that, you know, you can be sued. Your name can show up on paperwork or in a suit. And it talked about teachers who were privy to a student's violent writings in class who did absolutely nothing about it. She was found to be negligent. So your failure to act constitutes negligence and you are responsible. Okay, and then we talked about freedom of expression, prohibitions and school violence and what that has to do with everything. They talked a lot about gangs. We all know what gangs are. They talked about the prevalence of gangs, what their characteristics are, why they are formed, what their clothes look like. And it talked about our duties with gangs. And again, if you are reasonably aware that there is gang activity, then that means that there's the potential for threat or harm to your kids. So if you don't get rid of the gangs, then you're negligent if something happens. And then finally, school uniform dress policies. These were put in place largely because school districts are trying to keep kids safe. So they talked about the things that you should do. And basically, you need to involve all of your stakeholders, your parents, your community in developing policies whenever you enact a school uniform dress policy. Let's see here. There's so much that I want to say, but I can't. Let's talk about, I think this is the last thing, the zero tolerance policy. I thought perhaps I was for zero tolerance. You know, one strike, you're out. This comes into play a lot of times with suspensions and expulsions, as Shamika was talking about. But, you know, if you have a one strike, you're out or a zero tolerance policy, then you're basically infringing upon a student's due process rights because you're not giving them an opportunity to explain their side of the story. So, you know, we might be going too far with our zero tolerance policies. It basically came about in 1990 with Bill Clinton with the Gun-Free Act policy that came out in 1994 that said basically if you're found with a weapon or a gun on a school ground that you have to be expelled from school and it has to be for at least a year. So there's a lot more that could be said, but we are way past 8:30. So I think that's it.
All right. Good job. Thank you.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There was one more thing.
Go ahead.
Detectors. I'm sorry. Use of metal detectors. You can use them. Just you have to have reasonable suspicion that something is going on. That's it. I won't say anything else.
And you can't make Steve Stone walk through it, not everybody else. You can't pick on people.
Okay.
All right. So thank you very much. And you can stop sharing. And I'm going to wrap it up in 2 minutes. Just want to remind you, our next class session is on March the 20th. That is almost 3 weeks away. So in between that time, please start doing your PAP Part A, B, and C. Go ahead and start working on those. If you have individual questions, just shoot them to me. Remember, if you put something in the grade center for me to grade, if you don't get 100, you can keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. So even if it's the beginnings of your Part A and you're not quite sure about it, I'll give you feedback and you can create it and clean it up before it's done. So we're not going to be together for 3 weeks, so please use it to work on the PAP and those other assignments. You all are doing extremely well on that. Our next, and then after that, then our next class in Charlotte will be on the 6th and 7th, and we'll spend a lot of time on the PAP as well as advocacy. All right, any questions? If not, we'll end the meeting, and everybody have a great, I'll stick around. I'll stop recording if somebody wants to stick around, but other than that, we will see you on March the 20th. Keep working.